Okay, now that we've talked about the neural basis of learning and memory, we're now moving on to talk about models of memory and how memories can or cannot be encoded. So, what is memory? So, memory is an active information processing system that receives, organizes, stores, and recovers information from the environment. Now, remember, when we talk about memory, we're talking about an active system, so it's not passive. And so, because it isn't passive, our memory isn't like a photo. Rather, our memories are more like paintings in so much as we are actively constructing the image that we hold in our memories based on our previous preconceptions, based on others' preconceptions, based on our past expectations and experiences. There are three processes involved in how we use our memory. Those key processes are known as the information processing model. This model is not to be confused with another three system model, the multi-store model. So when I talk about multi-store model, I mean your sensory memory, your short-term memory, your long-term memory. Rather, the information processing model is this thing here. So we're talking about words that you will be familiar with in the context of your memory content. So what are we talking about? We're talking about encoding. So when we talk about what encoding is, this means that information taken in from the sensory environment is in a different format than the format that our brains use. So it has to be converted. So encoding is converting sensory information into a usable form or code that can be stored in memory. So we're talking about like electromagnetic light energy, for example, into electrochemical energy that our brain can use. Of course, the next one is storage. And so we know that information is stored in a relatively permanent capacity in our long-term memory. So storage is when information is held for a long period of time. Now that information held has to be encoded, otherwise our brains can't process it. The last one, or the last definition that we need to know, is retrieval. Now that's when we take information that is previously stored in long-term memory and we return it into consciousness. So remember, the set of conscious control is short-term memory. So we're locating old information in long-term memory and returning it into our consciousness awareness in short-term memory. So again, these three processes are known as the information processing model, not the multi-store model. Although they are separate models, in our multi-store model, so this here, we use those words encoding, storage, and retrieval a lot. So you need to make sure that you know how sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory all encode, store, and retrieve information taken from the sensory environment. Now let's talk a little bit more about Atkinson-Shiffrin's multi-store model. Just to be clear, we can refer to this model as either Atkinson-Shiffrin's model or the multi-store model. So what Atkinson and Shiffrin theorized was that our memory is made up of three substores or storage systems. They are separate, but they are interrelated. So while, as you can see in this diagram here, they are separate, we can see that they are always interacting with each other at any given moment to allow us to do the things we do. So we have these three stores and they have different roles, they have a different capacity, and they have a different duration. You need to make sure you know what the role, the capacity, and the duration is of each of these stores. The first store is sensory memory. Now, that is when information is incoming from the external environment. Now, remember, we have an unlimited capacity, but a very, very limited duration. Our sensory memory is a filter. So, what it prevents is us becoming overwhelmed by all of the information that we get bombarded with. We tend to only attend or pay attention to information that is relevant, that is novel, or is important to us. Now, it also has a secondary function in so much as it slightly overlaps our sensory information, so we do perceive the world as continuous. Now, if we, for example, attend to this information, if it's important, if it's novel, whatever, it can go into or flows into short-term memory. Now, again, if we don't attend to it, that information is lost. Our short-term memory. This is the seat of our conscious control. Short-term memory or working memory allows us to actively engage and manipulate the information that is held in that store to allow us to do the complex tasks that we do. Now remember, we have a limited capacity and a limited duration, so short-term memory does have its limitations. If we can rehearse the information, as we can see up here, we might be able to keep information into short-term memory a little bit longer. Now, in order for us to store it longer, it's probably not best to use maintenance rehearsal or simple rote learning. It's actually best to again encode the information and store it in long-term memory. Now again, long-term memory, that's where all of our long-term memories, obviously, are stored relatively permanently. So this is our longer lasting system. It has an unlimited capacity. It has a relatively permanent duration. And so if we need information, we retrieve it from long-term memory back into short-term memory. Now the thing about information in short-term memory is that it can also be lost. So it can be lost through decay or displacement, which I'll talk about in the next slide a little bit more. The thing that you have to consider in terms of sensory short-term and long-term memory is how they're similar and how they're different. Now, these differences are actually relatively easy. What I haven't talked about as yet is the type of information that is held in the storage systems. So we know in sensory memory, the information held is raw. We also know that the information is unconscious to us. This is very different to the information held in short-term memory. The information is encoded and it goes through another set of encoding in long-term memory or to get to long-term memory. Now the information is not unconscious, it is conscious. Now this is the only system where that information actually is conscious. Long-term memory, the information is encoded, so it's similar to short-term memory in that way, but it's held semantically or via meaning. There are similarities, however, between long-term memory and sensory memory in so much as in long-term memory we are also unconscious of that information too. In long-term memory you might be wondering what semantically means. What this means is information is held via meaning, and the best way to kind of imagine what that sounds like is like a computer filing system. So like on your computer, we're hoping that all of your files, all of the information is held in separate folders based on the meaning. So you might have a separate folder for psychology, you might have a separate folder for maths. Within that psychology folder, you should have a folder for the nervous system, you should have a folder for stress, you should have a folder for learning. Now, when you want to find that information or access it on your computer, then you have to go into the certain file and find it, and then access it. Now, that accessing is actually like retrieving the information back into your short-term memory. So, what are the things that you need to know about this multi-store model? Now, remember, we need to know the role, the capacity, and the duration. Now, these are the things that's probably easier to compare and contrast information to. And actually, I might add, I like the type of information because that's a good way to compare as well. So in terms of sensory memory, we know it's a filter. We know the information is raw, and we know it's unconscious. The capacity is unlimited, so it holds a lot of information, but the duration is very short. Now remember, you have to say the duration is 0.2 to 4 seconds. If you don't say the seconds, you will not get marks. Short-term memory, what does that do? That allows us to manipulate information to allow us to do everyday tasks. That information is encoded. The capacity is limited, so it is 7 plus or minus 2 items, or we can say this another way, the range is 5 to 9 items. The duration again is limited. It is 12 to 30 seconds. Now, this is really interesting because the capacity and the duration are actually both ways, I suppose, that we can lose information. So, we can lose information via capacity via displacement. So we know that the outer limit for our capacity is 9 items. So, if we were trying to memorize 10 numbers, and we were to start with an empty short-term memory, we might go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to 10. Now, once that 10th item is stored into memory, what's actually going to happen is this number over here, number 1, it's going to be pushed out. So it's been displaced by newer information. So that's how information can be lost through displacement, because the capacity of short-term memory has been exceeded. For duration, we lose that information via decay. Whoops. So we can lose that information via decay. So what that means is, if we hold the information for longer than 30 seconds, and we don't rehearse it, then it decays, okay? Because the duration of short-term memory has been exceeded. Now notice in both of these ways to lose information, I've said the capacity has been exceeded, the duration has been exceeded. You must make sure you say those words if you get questions about why they can't remember something, because either the capacity or the duration has been exceeded. In terms of long-term memory, this is really easy. So the capacity is unlimited and the duration is relatively permanent. Now, when we say the word relatively, what this means is there can be some decay. Now, generally, if you don't use information for a long period of time, it means there can be some decay in the long-term memory store, such as LTD. We might also see decay through things like Alzheimer's. Okay, so here's probably the point where we need to talk about types of long-term memory and where they are stored in the brain. Now, I'm also going to take this opportunity to say, if you can hear other noises, I'm really sorry. The people outside or next door, they're moving out, and so what you can probably hear in the background is the van of them like putting all their things in. So, sorry if that's distracting. Okay, so, long-term memory. Long-term memory is not all just chucked into one place, as I've explained previously. Remember, we are actually organising information via semantics or via meaning. Now, what this means is that we categorise information depending on that meaning, and we can categorise it based on if it's personal or not. We can categorise it based on how do we say it or how do we do it. Explicit and implicit memories are, I suppose, again, ways to categorise this information. So we're talking about how we retrieve information. So if we can retrieve it consciously, or we need to consciously go, ooh, what was that piece of information I needed? Or unconsciously, i.e. we get on a bike and we just start riding without thinking about it. So, explicit memory. This is memory that we retrieve consciously. So we don't say memory with awareness, I don't like that, but it's a good diagram. We don't say it's memory we have when we are conscious. That doesn't make sense. We retrieve the information consciously. Now, this type of information is knowing that. So what we are able to do is verbalize this information in words and pictures. So the two examples that we have are semantic memory. Now this information is impersonal. So it's information for facts and figures. So, for example, knowing the Prime Minister's name, knowing that Mount Kosciuszko is the highest mountain in Australia, knowing some psychology information that you can't remember how you learnt. Now, if you can remember the context in which you learnt your psychology information, so you can if you can remember being in the classroom and me standing at the board teaching you, then this isn't semantic because it's not impersonal. It's actually personal. So what that's an example of is an episodic memory. So episodic memories are personal. Personal. They involve memories of things such as the day of your 16th birthday party, when you got your license, again, sitting in the classroom watching one of your fellow students say something maybe a little bit silly, and we all had a good laugh. So, the different explicit memories are semantic, which is impersonal, facts and figures, and episodic memories, personal experiences. The other categorization of memory, other than explicit, is implicit memories. So these are memories that we know how to do, okay? So we've got knowing that and knowing how. So these are those memories involving things like emotions and fear, more specifically, I suppose. And these are memories to do with like motor movements that you just do. In terms of implicit memories, we do not generally consciously recall them. So that's why they're really hard to discuss, because you just do them, you don't actually put them into words. Also, interestingly, procedural memories or implicit memories, they're ones that don't really experience much degradation as we get older. Even in Alzheimer's, they tend to be the last ones to go. So in terms of implicit memories, we have procedural memories, and so they are memories for motor skills and actions like how to ride a bike, how to arrange some flowers, how to bake a cake, so the how-tos. We also have classically conditioned memories, and that's typically to do with things like fear. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Hang on, let's go back. So things to do with like fear. So as I said in class, if you had a phobia of cats, for example, it's not like you see a cat and you go, "Ooh, I'm going to be consciously afraid of this cat." So you don't actually have to think about retrieving that feeling of fear. It just happens. So what we should then talk about is our brain structures and where these types of memories are actually held, encoded, stored, consolidated, all that stuff. Now, a helpful thing for you to remember is things like the case studies that we've talked about. So HM plus Clive Waring are really good ones. Now, they're not explicitly examinable, but if you know about them, it will help your understanding, and VCAR can actually give you questions on these guys here. What they will do, though, is they'll give you a scenario that provides the information. However, if you've already prepared the information, it's going to actually help you. The other thing I really want you to consider is what happens when this structure is damaged. So the three things that you should know about the brain structures are, can I find them on a diagram? So diagram, their role, what they do, and what happens when damage occurs. Now that damage part is really easy. It's just the absence of the role. And I've said this about 3 million times, but still, you need to make sure what the roles are really well. So if you get a question about what happens when it's damaged, they obviously can't do that thing. So let's talk about these structures. Okay, let's talk about the cerebellum, the one that looks like fried chicken. So that's this one down here, the one at the base of the brain. So the cerebellum is involved in encoding and temporary storage of implicit procedural memories. So when we talk about implicit procedural memories, we're talking about how to ride a bike, all that stuff, okay? So for example, riding a bike. So This is actually because the cerebellum is involved in the coordination, the smoothing of fine motor movement. So that's why they kind of go together. So if we sustain damage to the cerebellum, then what could happen is we could not encode or temporarily store those types of memories. So for example, we might not be able to encode the memory of how to ride a bike. We may not be able to retrieve the memory of how to ride a bike. So let's next talk about the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is the structure that looks like apparently a seahorse. I think it more looks like a wishbone. So this is our hippocampus here. Now the hippocampus has a role in the consolidation, encoding and retrieval of all explicit, so we're talking about semantic and episodic, long-term memories. So that is the place that would be really super active when we're learning all of our psychology information, because all that information is explicit. Now remember, the hippocampus does not store that information. We have an interaction, okay, and remember that interaction is really, really important. So the hippocampus interacts with the cerebral cortex. So there's interaction there. And what it does is transfers new memories to the relevant parts of the brain. So it transfers it to the cerebral cortex so it can be stored, okay? So that's a really easy interaction to have in your mind for the SAC and the exam. Just as an FYI, the hippocampus was the part of the brain that was primarily damaged when HM and Clive Wearing lost their memories, because remember, they could not encode and consolidate new memories. So they are good ones to remember for the hippocampus. Let's now talk about the amygdala. So the amygdala are those knobbly things at the end of the brain. Sorry, not of the brain, the hippocampus, I should say. So the amygdala has a role in the consolidation, the formation and retrieval of emotional memories, especially those ones related to fear and aggression. So this is an implicit type of memory. So we have two places for implicit memories and two places for explicit memories. Now the amygdala also interacts pretty heavily with the hippocampus. And so what happens is, and again, we're actually talking about the relationship with the amygdala, the hippocampus, in terms of adrenaline, okay? So if you're not familiar with that, I would go back to the previous lecture that I've given. So what the amygdala does is when we are experiencing something that is emotionally significant, like getting your ATAR score, getting your first job, your first kiss, for example, what would happen is the amygdala signals to the hippocampus and it says, hey, this memory is really, really significant. You need to make sure you're encoding and consolidating that information really well. So the hippocampus will do that. It will consolidate it with significance and then send it again to the relevant parts of the brain to be stored. Okay, so that's kind of where we're getting that interaction from. The last thing we haven't talked about as yet is the cerebral cortex, which is like this wiggly bit here. And so what that does is it just stores explicit memories, long-term memories, I should say. Now, again, that involves both semantic and episodic memories, okay? Now, they're not all stored in one location. They are stored based on the modality of the memory. So, for example, if I have visual memories, so let's say I'm in Chadstone and I see you there, and I go, ooh, that's Luke, then that visual memory is actually going to be stored in my visual cortex, okay, or my visual center. If I am at school and I suddenly remember a song, then that auditory information is going to be stored in the temporal lobe, because remember, that's a part of our brain involved in auditory things. If I am remembering directions, how to get to my house to school, then that spatial information is going to be held and stored in the parietal lobe, because that's where the center is for directions and spatial learning. So now that we've talked about the models of memory, types of long-term memory, and where they're stored in the brain, we have to talk about forgetting. So forgetting refers to the inability to retrieve previously stored information. When we talk about forgetting, people tend to not realise that there's actually a difference between availability and accessibility. Now, if information is not available, it means that we've lost it. So it's decayed, it hasn't been stored, or whatever. Now, a lot of people think that they store information, but they haven't because they haven't been paying attention. So again, there's a difference between availability and accessibility. Accessibility means it has been stored, but we can't access the information, we can't retrieve it because we don't have the right cues or something like that, so we can't access it. The rest of the memory content that we're going to go through in this lecture and the next one is all about our ability and inability to encode and store information. So when we talk about state and context dependent cues, when we talk about Loftus's research, when we talk about Alzheimer's, we're actually talking about the psychological, the social, and the biological reasons why we can or can't encode and store information. So we are now talking about the psychological reasons why we can or can't store information. So we're looking at types of rehearsal. So this is about our ability or our inability to encode. Oh my goodness. Encode. So there are two types of ways to rehearse information: to manipulate information to either maintain it in short-term memory or encode it more effectively into long-term memory. We have maintenance rehearsal. So this is simple repetition of information so that it can be kept in in short-term memory for longer than 30 seconds. So this is all about that rote. Oh my goodness. This is all about that rote learning. So what we do is we say the thing, the words, the directions, the numbers over and over and over in our heads, either silently or out loud for a number of times. So for example, let's say you have given me your phone number. And so I would use maintenance rehearsal by subvocally repeating those numbers over and over in my head until I had a pen and paper handy, for example, or my phone handy. The advantages of maintenance rehearsal is that it increases the duration of time that information can be held in short-term memory. It's also good for meaningless information because it's easy. The problem is that it's easily interrupted by new material. It also may restrict new information from entering short-term memory. It doesn't really help information move into long-term memory, and it's a really shallow way to process the information. It's also really passive, and that's why it kind of leads to all of those disadvantages. The other way that we can, manipulate information for longer or better encoding and for longer retaining of information, I suppose, is through elaborative rehearsal. So this is where we assign meaning to information and link it to information already in long-term memory. We can do that through two ways. We can make a story, for example, but there may be some circumstances like a phone number, I suppose, or directions that aren't the best format for making a story. So what we could do then, if we can't make a story of the information given to us, is use the self-referencing effect. And that's when new information to be remembered is linked to personal experiences. So for example, if you are giving me an address that I have to remember, rather than making a story, I might link it to that number. So let's say I'm trying to remember 142 Murrumbina Road, for example. I might go, 142 Yesterday I ate 142 M&Ms, and Murrumbina, oh, that's where my best friend lives. So that's how I might remember the information. Now, the advantages of elaborative rehearsal is that it helps information move into long-term memory. And it does that because it adds more detail and also retrieval cues to the information. So the problem with that, though, is that it's more time consuming than maintenance rehearsal. It requires more effort. It's difficult to do that or to use when short-term memory is rapidly changing, and it actually relies on our ability to retrieve information from long-term memory when assigning meaning. So this is actually a much more active way of using information because the information is meaningful. So remember, for maintenance and elaborative rehearsal, it might be good to have an understanding of the similarities and the differences between these two stores. So the serial position effect. This is about the inability and the ability to encode, store, and retrieve information in terms of a list of words, numbers, pictures, whatever. It is evidence to support the multi-store model or the Atkinson-Shiffrin model of memory. So the serial position effect, what is it? In immediate free recall, items at the beginning and the end of a list are remembered better than those in the middle. Okay, so there are a few things here we need to look at. So when we have immediate free recall, when there is no delay, the items in the list, you have to refer to the list at the beginning and the end remembered better than those in the middle. Now this is a definition that has to be perfect. So what we normally see is retention as a U-shaped curve, as we see here. Now the things that you need to know about this U-shaped curve are, of course, our recency effect, so what it is and why it occurs, and the primacy effect, what it is and why it occurs. You also should be aware of what happens when there is a delay between learning and recall. So the primacy effect. This is superior recall for items at the beginning of a list. Why does this happen? The first items of a list, they should enter an empty short-term memory, and so they have enough time to be rehearsed and transferred or encoded into long-term memory. The primacy effect will always occur regardless of the delay between learning and recall. So this always occurs. We will always have superior recall for items at the start of a list. The recency effect is superior recall for items at the end of a list. The reason is because the items at the end of a list are retained in short-term memory. And so we tend to remember those items at the end first because they're just already in our short-term memory. So items at the end are retained in short-term memory. Now, this is really important. The recency effect will not occur if there is a delay of over 30 seconds between learning and recall. So, if I make a shopping list and I forget to take it with me when I drive down to the shops, well, obviously that drive down to the shops will be longer than 30 seconds. So the recency effect will not occur. Why? Well, because the duration of short-term memory has been exceeded. And so the information that was in short-term memory will be decayed or will decay, and so therefore lost. Okay, so the last slide for this particular little part is context and state-dependent cues. So this is about how we can or how we cannot retrieve information depending on if we have retrieval cues present or not. Now remember, a retrieval cue is something that helps us to retrieve something from long-term memory. Now, they work best if the retrieval cue matches the information being recalled when it was learnt in the first place. So that's kind of why I give you lots of different ways to remember things, or we do different things with that information, so when you're in the exam or the SAC, you will have all sorts of retrieval cues in which to retrieve the information that you need. we have two types of retrieval cues. We have context-dependent cues and state-dependent cues. Now, the thing to remember for this, guys, is you need to make sure your definitions and your explanations are really perfect, okay? You need to make sure you're discussing in terms of information encoded and information retrieved. And so we're suggesting that a retrieval cue is present when the information is both encoded and then retrieved. If you struggle to write this down, what I would do is divide it into 2 dot points. So you talk about encoding and then you talk about retrieval. So, what is a context-dependent cue? That is an external cue. So things like the colour of the walls, the formation of the desks in the classroom, the way the classroom smells, things like that. These are environmental cues in the specific context where a memory was formed. So memory was formed. And when they are retrieved in that same context, those environmental cues act as retrieval cues. So we have the first part of our answer here. So the environmental cues, like the formation of the desk, that were present when the psychology information was learned, will act as a retrieval cue to help us recall the information when we retrieve the psychology information in the same classroom, because that environmental stimuli, the formation of the desks, are present. State-dependent cues, they are internal. So we're talking about our psychological or our physiological state, like when you were drunk, when you were sad, if you were under the influence of some other kind of drug. So again, we need to divide this down into when we encode information and when we retrieve information. So let's have a look. An individual's internal physiological and psychological state, such as when we were drunk, at the time where the memory was formed, so that's our first point, will act as a retrieval cue to help access those memories when we retrieve the information when we are in the same state. So don't forget to talk about both encoding and retrieval.